ladies. All right, so we're going to take a look at the collapse of the Soviet Union. I've also linked some extra videos into Google Classroom, so when you see like certain videos pop up, I'm just going to move past them. You can watch them on your own time. So let's take a look at what could be a do now, but something I don't want you to lose practice in your CRQs. So when again we're talking about historical circumstances that led to the development depicted in this Time magazine cover. So here's our cover. We see that we are seeing nuclear power, the stakes get higher and higher. We're seeing this nuclear weapon go off, and we're hopefully remembering the historical circumstances is discussing what caused. So you're not talking about, this as an effect on American people right now, but what caused this nuclear power to become an issue? Sorry, guys. So obviously, try to give yourself about, those 5 minutes like normal. Try to see what you can do. I can go over some answers tomorrow. So we're going to talk about why the Cold War entered a period of détente in the 1970s and ultimately why the Soviet Union collapsed. I'm giving you your objectives and do-nots because I don't want you guys to lose practice with your normal pieces of class. All right, so first we got to talk about the arms race. So again, for the most part, we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the ending of World War II with the dropping of the atomic bomb. But the arms race is the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. So you can take a look at your graph over here, and you can see the number of nuclear warheads. So the United States drastically jumped very quickly, but the Soviet Union was not that far behind. It took them a little longer, but then the Soviet Union surpassed the United States. And because the Soviet Union and Russia surpassed the US, this is why we have so many issues with nuclear proliferation in the world today. Because when the Soviet Union collapsed and fell apart, all these other nations that were created all of a sudden had these nuclear weapons, and they either kept them for themselves or they sold at the highest bidder. So remember, once one side starts to build up, the other side feels more threatened, which means they're going to build up. So once the US started building up, the Soviet Union felt threatened, so they began to build up, which of course causes the United States to continue to want to build more and more as well. This creates something that's going to be referred to as mutually assured destruction or MAD. And this is the understanding that both the United States and the Soviet Union realized that they could actually destroy each other. So, this mutually assured destruction is this idea that we both agree that we could destroy the other one and in turn end up pretty much destroying ourselves. So, the United States possessed atomic weapons until 1949. They were it. That was just the United States. But then the Soviet Union was able to test their own atomic bomb. And eventually, as it gets further, you start developing more powerful weapons. So the hydrogen bomb in 1952, it is smaller than the atomic bombs, but it's way more powerful. And then the Soviet Union developed the hydrogen bomb in 1953. So this ends up becoming into MAD, which is the understanding that each side had enough weapons to destroy the other side, which discouraged all-out nuclear warfare. The United States was not going to blow up the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union, before that bomb hit Soviet Union could release enough to destroy the United States. This is what's going to keep people at pretty much an even pace for a little while. We're going to continue to build, but we're going to start to realize, like, oh crap, like we actually could destroy each other and we need to prevent that from happening. So we enter a period known as détente. All right, it's a French word, means relaxation, and we tend to refer to it between 1969 and 1979, when the Soviet Union and the United States kind of relax their tension. They start actually opening some trade. They start actually speaking to each other, and it makes it kind of flow a little easier. So détente is this very short 10-year period right in here. The presidents we associate with détente are people like Nixon, Ford, and Carter. Once we get into Reagan, you see a switch in detente is ended, and it becomes Reagan is now going to destroy the Soviet Union, and that is going to be the goal of his presidency. So in detente, it didn't end the Cold War. The Cold War still existed. However, you started to see both sides start to realize we need to figure something out. It's going to start with President Nixon, who is going to be the first president to go to communist China. He goes in 1972, but of course, not to be offset by China. The Kremlin in Moscow, which is the government of Moscow, or the government of Russia, the Soviet Union, invites Nixon to go to the Soviet Union. So he later on in the same year is actually inviting Nixon, who's the first president to go to the Soviet Union, um, and they start to sign a couple agreements to limit nuclear weapons. The first one, which is really the one you really need to know, is SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. And this is the very first thing. It's one of the big things that Nixon like holds on as like his, I did this, and no one else was able to kind of moment in presidency. Is this is the first time when the Soviet Union and the United States both agreed that we're going to kind of like lower these arms. We're not going to continue to build as many as humanly possible. It continues under Gerald Ford with the Helsinki Final Act, and this is in Finland. All right. And both, again, Brezhnev and Ford get together and they start to actually start signing things for human rights. But if we remember things about the Soviet Union that kind of recall of what Stalin did, Stalin set into motion a system where the Soviet Union wasn't always the best about human rights. And if you see, Brezhnev was nervous about signing this, but his foreign minister reassured him it's just a piece of paper. Um, but Ford looked at it as a time bomb for the Soviets, where it established an internationally accepted standard by which communist governments could be held accountable for the treatment of their citizens. Ford looked at it as this is an opportunity for the Soviet Union to kind of put their name on this piece of paper and say we're going to do X, Y, and Z for our citizens. And if they weren't, we could actually start to hold them accountable for that. So all of those people who protest against communism, who tried to speak out against communism and were thrown in jail or lost their rights, that meant that they were no longer able, they could be held accountable for doing those things. So it's like the first kind of little step. While the Soviet Union doesn't fully fall in line with it, they at least acknowledge that this is something that they could be held accountable for. Carter, who is the president after Ford, he spends a lot longer trying to, actually end the Cold War. The problem becomes is that in 1979, the United States screws up and gets involved in the Iran Revolution, and we're going to talk about this in Unit 3, the Iranian Revolution. So we'll get more details, but it's good to kind of discuss it right now, where the United States was involved with Iran, and we had overthrown their government. We had put the Shah of Iran in power. He stayed in power for about 20-ish years, and then 1979 he's overthrown, and then American embassy is taken over, and these Americans are held captives for over a year. And the hostage crisis, this that is now going to cause a huge gas crisis in the United States. Our economy starts to tank, and this starts to make us look like the weak ones, and the Soviet Union actually look like a little bit more stronger. So the entire world kind of looks at us as like, you're not doing as well as you were doing in the past. And then the Soviet Union completely break detente when they invade Afghanistan. And there's very little we could do about their invasion of Afghanistan. When they invade Afghanistan, and when we get to talk about modern terrorism in Unit 4, uh, we'll talk about Al Qaeda, but they actually receive a lot of funds from us because we provide weapons and money to organizations in Afghanistan to defeat the Soviets during this time. So that ends up kind of, turning our back to us because you have people like Osama bin Laden who were very anti-Soviet, but were also very anti-American and saw us getting involved in this as being, a reason why we shouldn't be sticking our nose in other people's business, basically. So, like I just talked about, the Soviet Union in the 1970s was at the very height of their power. They're going to very decline very, very quickly. Um, there were communist victories in Vietnam. There was lots of communist countries being taken over in South America, and the United States economy started to slow down. We People in the United States didn't trust the government anymore after everything that they dealt with Vietnam. We were in the middle of a gas crisis. Our economy was tanking, and there was when people looked at the two countries, they saw the Soviet Union as being very successful and the United States as being kind of not successful. But in the 1980s, the Soviet economy began to slow down. They entered economic stagnation, which means they're not growing, they're not progressing, they're just stagnant, they're just there. And this happens, and people start to realize the Soviet Union really isn't as powerful as they once thought. Eastern European countries, who are all these satellite nations, they're starting to suffer because they're relying on the success of the Soviet Union. And now you see a high rise of poverty in the Soviet Union. So in the 1980s, as the Soviet Union starts to kind of stagnate and go down and poverty rises, the United States goes back into a more successful economy. We have Reagan take over in 1979, and with his policies, you start to see a growth in the American economy. All right, the Soviet Union is spending way too much money on the war in Afghanistan, on trying to take over Afghanistan, and that's going to damage them a lot because they can't afford to have a pay for another war. And then you have Reagan in the United States take over, and his whole goal in his presidency was to destroy the Soviet Union. And he basically does it by spending more money than the Soviet Union could ever possibly realize that they could spend. So he's going to end up spending so much more money than the Soviet Union. And basically, one of the big reasons the Soviet Union collapses is because Reagan outspends him. And the Soviet Union cannot compete with the United States. So in 1985, you have Mikhail Gorbachev coming to power. We've talked about political cartoons, so this image right here is Mikhail Gorbachev, but if you notice, he has what's known as a port wine stain on his head. If you see a political cartoon and you see a character with this kind of stain on their forehead, they're referencing Mikhail Gorbachev. So just like we talked about, Joseph Stalin has the very big bushy mustache, or sometimes the larger nose. Hitler's always got, his stale, mustache for him. Gorbachev is always going to have this little port wine stain, right on his forehead. But he comes up with two concepts. He comes up with glasnost and perestroika. So glasnost means openness. He gives freedom to the press, access to Western press. He creates political unions that oppose communism. He allows history books to come out that challenge the Soviet Union. Dissidents are released from prison. He grants religious tolerance. You can travel to Western countries. He basically opens the doors. And once people start to realize how crappy they've been living and how good other areas are living in the rest of the West, they're like, oh, we don't continue to want this. He also does perestroika, which is the restructuring of the government and economy. So farmers are allowed to sell goods on their free market. They appointed new members of the secretariat and reduced the size of the bureaucracy, supported limited private ownership. He does these two things in an attempt to save the Soviet Union. Unfortunately for Gorbachev, it's too little too late, and he's not able to really save the Soviet Union. We're going to see in China tomorrow's lesson where you're going to see that Deng Xiaoping does a lot of the same types of things, but he's able to keep China successful, whereas Gorbachev is going to have a hard time keeping the Soviet Union together with these two new policies. Gorbachev and Reagan meet multiple times throughout their time in power. You can see that they're meeting. They sign different treaties. We talked a little bit about the Star Wars program and how the Star Wars program was Reagan's idea that he was going to basically build this set of lasers that was going to take out any kind of Russian nuclear missiles. And the Soviets refused to really sign any nuclear treaties, any arms reducement treaties until this Star Wars program was gone, even though it never existed. It was not feasible in the 1980s to do this. In 1989, we have the fall of the Berlin Wall. So if you remember, back in 1961, under Nikita Khrushchev, you have the Berlin Wall erected. Okay, it's pretty much erected almost completely overnight. The reason, again, going back to the reasoning why, there was a mass migration of East Germans who were unhappy with communism. They left to go for new employment opportunities, and this wall separated families. It separated East Germans from their employment opportunities. It separated them from their family, from their friends, and this sent the message that even if East Germans did enjoy communism, they're not allowed to leave. So it doesn't matter if you like where you're living or not, you can't leave this anymore. Anyone who has attempted to escape East Berlin through a variety of methods, if you watched the video I posted for the containment lesson on the Berlin Wall, you saw that there's many different attempts to escape, and they're just not able to. They're shot on sight. You had people who tried to dig under the wall, people who tried to fly over the wall, people who tried to just like drive through the barricades. It didn't work. Then on June 12th, 1987, Reagan delivers the Berlin Wall speech at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, and then this is his speech in here. I'm going to have this available so that you can watch it. I highly recommend watching it and taking a look at what he says. And his big part is this: Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And it really becomes this motto for the ending of the Cold War. So 2 years after this, November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall does fall down. And there are lots of demonstrations. It falls because there's a new government in East Germany who, without really realizing it, makes a declaration that if they want to go to the other side of the wall, they can. And so they show up to do that. And this could have been a disaster. You could have had these soldiers open fire, and instead they just opened the wall and let people in. The wall comes down by people. People take the wall down, not the government, not anybody. Literally, the German people dismantle this wall, and it is all over the news, and they celebrate. It was a party. And again, I have this posted in Google Classroom. I suggest you watch it. It is the live visual of it, but I just want to show you a few things. You can see how many people have gathered at this wall. They are standing on top of it. They are standing next to it. This is the first time these people had seen their relatives, had seen their friends for, 20 years. During the next few years, you start seeing a break apart of the Soviet Union. Um, Gorbachev's relationship with the satellite states and the Soviet Republic starts to crumble. The Communist Party of Moscow indirectly controls the government of these fifth Soviet republics, if you remember. And as Gorbachev institutes glasnost and perestroika, he starts to say, well, whatever kind of government these other countries would like to have that's not communist, that's fine. Versus before, it has always been the understanding that those countries should have communist governments and that communist governments are a required part of this. It's a necessity. And any government that attempted to become established before this time that wasn't communist was immediately thrown in prison, thrown in jail, executed, any of those things. And he just flat out sits there and changes it. And he goes, nope, they can have whatever government they want, which basically means most of these satellite stations, especially in places like Poland, immediately vote for a non-communist government and immediately change for a new venue and immediately separate from the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev formally legalizes the formation of other political parties. He gets rid of the article in the Soviet Constitution that guarantees supremacy of the Communist Party. And so now you start seeing this huge thing, this huge change. They're starting to now challenge the Communist Party. Gorbachev's lessons the iron fist, tight control, republics began to take advantage of new freedoms, and they start to declare that they want sovereignty, which means self-rule, okay? And they want to succeed and leave the Soviet Union. So I want you to take a look at these two words, make sure you know them. You should know succession because that's a big part of the Civil War from US history, but sovereignty, this idea of self-rule, this is going to be a big part of Unit 3 when we're talking about decolonization. So if you look in here, at this map, I want you to make sure you remember that there are going to be 15 nations that are going to be created when the Soviet Union collapses. Number one being Russia, which is the largest, but all of these other little tiny nations right in here, these are all going to be created as a result of the Soviet Union collapse. And if you take a look at the graphic that's over here, you can start to see when that all started happening, which was 1989, 1990, right around that same time the Berlin Wall collapses and that Gorbachev really establishes what's happening. So in 1989, Lithuania declares itself independent, and by 1991, every other Soviet state had left. Ukraine declares independence on August 24th, 1991. This is going to be one of the biggest reasons why we still see problems between Russia and Ukraine. If you remember back to when we talked about the forced famine in the Ukraine, you're going to see that is a big issue. The Ukrainian people and the Russian people do not like each other, and they haven't for a very long time. In December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev resigns and turns over all responsibilities to Boris Yeltsin, who was elected the first president of Russia. And officially, the Warsaw Pact is dissolved. and the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. Countries can be created and destroyed very, very easily. So when we are talking about the Soviet Union not existing anymore, it means it does not exist. If you look at a map in 1990, it'll show you the Soviet Union. If you look at a map that was made in after, in 1992, you're going to see Russia and all these 15 states of the Soviet Union that are now brand new and have to figure out their own new form of government. All right, so normally I don't give you an exit ticket, but I wanted you to, again, to get that CRQ practice. So explain the historical circumstance that led to the historical development depicted in this image. So in this image, we see someone smashing the Berlin Wall. Here you have all the Western Berliners. So the Berlin people that were part of, Western Germany, that were part of the United States. Up here, if you see, you can see a lot of the Soviet soldiers standing on top of the wall. And what this image is looking at, he's smashing it open. This is one of the most famous images for the Berlin Wall. And again, I'll give you answers to these on the next day. So looking at this, so here's your success criteria, what you should be able to know. So you should still be doing note summaries, you should still be taking notes. I have posted a Cold War timeline to help you prepare for this unit exam, so you make sure you know all the pieces of the Cold War. Tuesday, so this class right here is happening on Monday. Tuesday, I'm going to give you one more lecture on modern communism in China. And then on Wednesday, that is your study day. Office hours are 12:30 to 1, and I will have a weekly summary for you on that Wednesday. On Thursday, I will give you the multiple choice portion of your test, and on Friday, I will give you your enduring issues essay portion of that test. The multiple choice portion of your test will be taken on Google Forms. So you will get your automatic feedback right away how you did at that portion of the test, and then you will take your essay the next day. If anybody has any issues, questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to email me. Let me know immediately if you're stuck on something so that I can help you through it, or if something is not working. All right, as always,